Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we're checking out the first dual mode LCD monitor that's landed in my office, the Dell Alienware AW2725QF. This display packs a native 27-inch 4K 180Hz IPS LCD panel, but at the press of a button can be converted to run at 1080p 360Hz, in a similar vein to recent high-end 4K WOLED monitors. The idea here is to extend the flexibility and versatility of 4K monitors. They're already great for productivity work or single-player gaming due to their high resolution, but with a faster refresh rate available at a lower resolution, they become much better for competitive multiplayer gaming as well. Technically, the maximum 180Hz and 360Hz refresh rates are overclocked modes on this monitor, with the default being 165Hz at 4K and 330Hz at 1080p, but you shouldn't have any issues bumping that up to the maximum in the OSD menu. In addition, we're getting the usual adaptive sync features and very basic edge-lit dimmed HDR capabilities with display HDR 400 certification. The focus here is more on the refresh rate capabilities and dual mode support than HDR, so we'll see how that plays out given the price tag of $600 US. Personally, I think this monitor looks fantastic from a design perspective. The front is dominated by the LCD panel with very slim bezels on three sides, with the chin along the bottom housing an Alienware logo. The rear is minimalist with a single large plastic panel flowing into the stand connection and port areas, plus there's some RGB LED lighting in the Alien head logo and large 27 text. While the outer surfaces used throughout the design are plastic, it's a premium plastic with a great matte finish and simple black color scheme that should blend in nicely with most desk setups. For the most part, it looks like a premium product. The stand is also decent with height, tilt, swivel and pivot adjustability plus a moderate level of stability. The maximum height on offer is only okay. I like how small the base is. Its six-sided design is perfect for different keyboard positions and maximizing desk space around the monitor. On the left side, there's also a built-in headphone stand that can be extended or retracted into the monitor's body. For ports, we're getting one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC and two HDMI 2.1 48GB/s ports, one of which supports eARC. There's also a 4-port USB hub with two Type-A ports on the rear and a Type-C port on the bottom edge of the screen, in addition to a third Type-A. While the monitor does have USB-C, it doesn't work as a display input and power delivery is limited to just 7.5 watts. The OSD is controlled through a directional toggle on the center of the bottom edge. It includes Dell's typical feature set, including a range of color controls and plenty of game-specific features, such as an FPS counter, shadow boosting, crosshairs, and a sniper mode. It's a fast and easy to navigate interface, which is nice to see. The screen coating is a very standard matte finish for an IPS LCD, which you'll probably have experienced before on other monitors. It has a light to moderate amount of coating grain and does a great job at minimizing mirror reflections, although obviously it diffuses light in brighter environments. Given that you might want to use this sort of display for desktop productivity work, I think the choice to go with this sort of matte finish makes sense. Now, the big selling point to the AW2725QF is its dual mode functionality, where you can switch between 4K 180Hz and 1080p 360Hz at the press of a button. There's no dedicated button for this Dell variant, but you can quickly switch modes either by holding down or double tapping the OSD control joystick. Switching takes a couple of seconds and runs the monitor in an entirely new configuration, appearing to your source device, for example, a Windows PC, as a completely different monitor. This keeps things nice and separate so games don't default to or force you to use a configuration that you don't want. The good news is that, like the dual mode WOLEDs that I tested previously, there are no fundamental performance differences between the 4K and 1080p modes. This means we get the same color performance in both configurations and the same response time performance. So when you game at 4K 144Hz, you get the same response times as 1080p 144Hz in the same overdrive setting, and features like adaptive sync work in both modes. Settings carry across the modes by default, so if you change overdrive settings in the 4K mode, it'll also apply to the 1080p mode, unless you turn off the dual resolution sync setting, which then allows for a separate set of settings in each resolution mode. I love that Dell gives you the flexibility to configure this display how you'd like, whether it's synchronized settings or not. As for the actual resolution experience, the AW2725QF uses integer scaling in its 1080p mode. So for one 1080p pixel, 4 native 4K pixels are activated. For the most part, this makes the panel look like a native 1080p panel, with some small differences in scaled subpixel layout having an impact on text. Relative to the dual mode W OLEDs, this LCD ends up looking better in its 1080p mode because the W OLEDs don't use integer scaling and are a larger panel size. 1080p at 27 inches doesn't look great on this monitor, and for any sort of tasks that requires a decent resolution, you just use the 4K mode, but it's an improvement on scaled W OLED 1080p at 32 inches. For gaming, the 1080p configuration is perfectly fine and very usable. In competitive games where the focus is on motion, you won't notice much of an impact to resolution outside of maybe the UI and menus. Let's look at response time performance, and I'll start with the 4K mode at 180Hz. There's just 3 overdrive settings, and the default fast mode is reasonable, with a 6.5 millisecond response time average, no real overshoot, and cumulative deviation around 460. But the good news is the panel meets acceptable refresh compliance at 4K even in the lowest overdrive setting. The super fast mode is a step up in performance, improving to a 4.6 millisecond average response time, though there is now some overshoot for the smallest transitions. Effectively, this replaces a bit of the blur seen in the fast mode with a small amount of inverse ghosting, a trade-off that ultimately makes both modes look somewhat similar. The extreme mode has massive amounts of overshoot in this configuration and shouldn't be used. It's a different situation at 360Hz. The fast mode here isn't especially fast, with a 7.8 millisecond response time average, though cumulative deviation is reasonable and there's no overshoot. Using super fast bumps up the response time to 6.7 milliseconds on average, again with no overshoot, but here using the extreme mode is good for a 5.9 millisecond response average and yes, a few strange but accurate overshoot results. There's not much overshoot when using the extreme mode at this high refresh rate, which is good to see given what the situation was at 180Hz. Unfortunately though, there's no mode that provides strong refresh compliance at 360Hz, so the screen is being a bit bottlenecked by its response time performance. The AW2725QF uses variable overdrive, and the results across the refresh rate range are a little unusual. For example, using the fast mode, we start out with performance that's generally too slow to use with the 1080p 360Hz configuration. Performance actually gets worse at 300Hz relative to 360Hz and slowly improves to around the 180Hz mark, then goes backwards again at 165Hz with some very weird numbers. Then there's a couple of middling results before performance improves again for the lowest refreshes. All the results you see below 180Hz are the same whether we use the 4K or 1080p configurations. Superfast uses a similar variable refresh rate cadence for refresh rates above 100Hz, just with every mode being a bit faster than the fast setting. At no point are any of these refresh rates producing extreme levels of overshoot, but performance isn't quite there for the highest refreshes. Weirdly, below 100Hz, the superfast setting actually produces slower response time averages than the fast setting, but with less overshoot and better cumulative deviation. This means that even with the transition time going backwards, generally the experience is better with the super fast mode at refresh rates around 160Hz. In the 4K mode, using super fast is ultimately the best for variable refresh rate gamers, and it leads to a single overdrive mode experience. The extreme setting is the best choice for the very highest refresh rates, but it quickly produces too much overshoot at lower refreshes. Oddly, again, we see performance go backwards between 360 and 300Hz, and then there's a big drop off to 240Hz, which leads to significant amounts of overshoot. So the extreme setting is really only optimal for above 300Hz gaming. Below that, you should drop to the super fast setting. I also noticed a bug with this mode where occasionally at 360Hz extreme mode performance would be much worse, resulting in performance more like this. It might be related to issues with a fixed 360Hz refresh rate after changing the refresh, not sure, as making it perform like this wasn't reliable, but most of the time with variable refresh rate gaming, you should see performance more in line with the good results. In the 1080p configuration, there isn't a single overdrive mode experience, though you could configure the monitor to switch into extreme in the 1080p mode and super fast for the 4K mode, because if you're gaming below 180Hz, probably doesn't make sense to use the 1080p configuration. Unfortunately though, there is a small part of the 1080p refresh rate range that is higher than what is possible at 4K, but not optimal for extreme mode gaming. There's also the issue of overall response time performance for higher refresh rates. Generally, this panel isn't fast enough for a full 360Hz experience, with the speed on offer being more appropriate for 240Hz at best. Perfectly fine at 4K, not so great for the 1080p mode. With response times that aren't fast enough to keep up with a 360Hz refresh, this can hold back motion performance relative to proper 360Hz capable panels. 360Hz on this screen will still give you input lag and smoothness advantages relative to the 240Hz its response times are more capable of. However, clarity isn't always that different between 360 and 240Hz. We can see this looking at various UFO test images. There is no doubting that the 1080p mode does offer enhanced motion clarity relative to the 4K 180Hz configuration, so switching over to 1080p is still beneficial for competitive gaming. But the differences between 240 and 360Hz are not massive, and especially when compared to some of the faster 360Hz LCDs I've tested, there's a clear difference indicative of slower response times holding the AW2725QF back. There's also no backlight strobing support on this display, if you were wondering. Compared to other monitors, the AW2725QF competes well in its 4K mode, with performance around the mark of other popular products like the Gigabyte M28U, although tuning isn't quite as strong as the LG 27GR93U with its similar response time but lower overshoot. The 1080p 360Hz mode is a bit less impressive and probably could have done with better tuning. With superfast being the optimal single variable refresh setting choice for both the 4K and 1080p modes, performance on average across the refresh rate range is very similar in both configurations, with any small differences due to the inclusion of extra refresh rates in the 1080p mode average. This level of performance is very similar to the Asus XG27UCS and LG 27GR93U, but doesn't quite reach the best monitors that we've tested. Cumulative deviation, which measures the balance between speed and overshoot, shows very similar average performance for the AW2725QF relative to other 4K gaming monitors like the XG27UCS and M27U. Most recent 27-inch 4K monitors that I've tested have delivered performance in that 500 to 550 range. With its wider 360Hz refresh rate range, cumulative deviation improves slightly, but not to a level that I'd be satisfied with compared to the best 360Hz displays like the Asus PG27AQN. This panel just isn't on the same speed level as the AQN. At 120Hz, the AW2725QF offers a pretty typical experience from a 4K gaming monitor, suitable but not amazing for console inputs. The same can be said for 60Hz gaming, which is a mid-table result. Input lag is one of the strengths of this monitor, particularly in its 1080p mode. There is little to no processing lag difference between the configurations. In fact, I measured the 1080p mode as offering slightly less of a delay. When run at 1080p, the refresh lag component is halved, which lowers overall input lag and makes the display feel more responsive to use, although response times are holding it back a bit in total lag. Still, this is one of the most responsive configurations that you can get in a 4K LCD, even if it means sacrificing resolution. Power consumption is pretty low from this monitor at just 29 watts, displaying a full white 200 nit image. It's not going to take the efficiency crown from products like the XG27UCS, but it's also not as inefficient as the Gigabyte M28U, for example. Not that the M28U is especially inefficient either, but comparatively it uses about 10 watts more. The Dell model is in a nice middle ground position. When it comes to color space coverage, this monitor offers a very familiar experience, 95% coverage of DCI-P3, along with 71% coverage of Rec 2020. This is right about what we expect from a modern IPS that doesn't use any additional quantum dot layers. It's totally fine for most gaming applications. Out-of-the-box color performance is okay. In grayscale, there were some minor issues such as a slight yellow tint, but Delta E performance was average. For saturation and color checker, we get the usual oversaturation issues for standard sRGB SDR content, where colors are expanded up to fill the wide color gamut. Again, there is no difference in color performance between the 4K and 1080p configurations. Relative to other monitors, factory grayscale performance is mid-table. There are a few examples of much better calibration, but others are within a few Delta E points on average. In color checker, these results are slightly better than average. Dell includes an sRGB mode with this monitor, although enabling it will lock you out of some settings such as white balance. In this configuration, grayscale performance is improved, now delivering a 3.72 Delta E ITP average, which is pretty good, and white balance is more where it should be. The gamut emulation part of the sRGB mode is also quite effective, reducing oversaturation and giving a more accurate experience for SDR content. Relative to other monitors, sRGB grayscale calibration is better than average. Color checker performance is more in the mid-table range. However, with an average Delta E ITP below 5.0, I'm satisfied that it's factory calibrated and it delivers a nice experience. Performance can be improved through a full calibration, and I did so using Portrait Display's CalMan. This is a great monitor to calibrate, which is usually the case with IPS LCDs, with the only remaining concerns being around total gamut coverage. For most people, it's probably wide enough in terms of P3, but professionals might want something with closer to 99% coverage or better coverage of Adobe RGB. Maximum SDR brightness is excellent at 486 nits, which is plenty bright enough for the vast majority of people. Minimum brightness of 42 nits is also pretty decent here, providing a good range of brightness options. There's nothing particularly special about the AW2725QF's contrast ratio. It's an IPS LCD after all, but it's good to confirm a result above 1000:1. This makes the display a better choice for contrast compared to the Asus XG27UCS or the LG 27GR93U with at least a 25% higher contrast ratio. However, when looking across all display types, IPS LCD still doesn't perform that well, smoked by VA LCDs and of course OLEDs. I was very satisfied with the viewing angles available on this monitor with no concerns during regular usage. Uniformity was also pretty good. I noticed a bit of fall off along the left and right edges, but nothing that was too bad for gaming or productivity apps. I'd say this is a pretty standard LCD experience once again. Now, when it comes to HDR performance, the AW2725QF is not very good by modern standards. There are only 24 edge-lit dimming zones, delivering semi-HDR hardware capabilities. There is a little bit of local dimming available, but as each zone is a large vertical strip that extends from the top of the screen to the bottom, there is very little control available to dim around bright objects. If there's something in the middle of the screen that needs to be illuminated brightly, the entire backlight zone stretching from top to bottom will switch on, creating blooming around bright objects that extends all the way to the edges of the screen. In many situations, most or all of the local dimming zones will be active, and this can look pretty bad in darker or more shadow-rich content. In many difficult scenarios, the contrast on offer will either be at the native level of the panel or only slightly enhanced. This is why I describe this type of backlight implementation as semi-HDR. It might look better than HDR, or it might not. It depends on the scene. However, this monitor does offer satisfactory levels of brightness and color gamut, meeting the minimums we look for, so it's a genuine step above some of the Display HDR 400 tier products you'll see that lack any sort of HDR hardware capabilities at all. In terms of brightness, we're getting around 750 nits full screen, 710 nits with a 10% window, and 540 nits with a 2% window. As we moved through these charts, the AW2725QF got progressively less competitive, and the result at 2% is very underwhelming, as the edge-lit system just isn't sufficient for that sort of control. What we also see is that best case contrast ratios are only around 12,000:1, which is better than the native panel contrast ratio, but well short of a good level. It's only when we get to monitors with full array local dimming do we usually see the contrast requirements met. Worst case contrast and checkerboard contrast is really no better than native panel performance, again, because it just can't do enough local dimming. While the HDR experience is not good, it's also not a total write-off, especially if you don't really care about contrast and only want brightness. In real scene brightness, this monitor is capable of some reasonable results, though short of the best LCDs. I also found that EOTF tracking is very accurate outside of the bottom part of the range, which the monitor just isn't capable of at all. Even with edge-lit local dimming, the darkest 4% of the PQ range is missing. Also, this monitor does support Dolby Vision, though I don't think it's a particularly useful inclusion on this level of HDR hardware. In the Hub Essentials checklist, generally, Dell do a good job of advertising this monitor, especially for brightness, which was listed lower than I recorded. HDR support is borderline, given it's semi-HDR, and Dell claimed that a 1 millisecond response time was most observed in the extreme mode with a 0.5 millisecond minimum. In that mode, the minimum claim is around accurate, but the most observed claim is dubious, and this would be with extreme levels of overshoot, so I don't think it counts. This is more like a 5 to 6 millisecond monitor in the sensible modes. In the feature support matrix, we're seeing a pretty typical showing from an IPS LCD. Whether or not this display has a single overdrive mode experience and good refresh compliance depends on whether we're talking about the 4K or 1080p modes. It's good to see features like Dolby Vision, even if not especially useful on this monitor, a well-calibrated sRGB mode, and graceful SDR HDR switching. All of those things improve the experience. What's lacking are some of the higher-end HDR features like a reasonable contrast ratio, as well as things like decent USB-C capabilities and a KVM switch. There's also no backlight strobing, something that is often seen on higher refresh rate monitors. Overall, the Dell Alienware AW2725QF lives or dies based on whether you want the dual mode functionality or not. At $600 US, you could make a case to purchase it if you like the versatility that the 1080p 360Hz mode provides, in addition to 4K 180Hz. If you're not overly interested in that mode and just want a great 4K gaming monitor, there are better choices at lower price points. The key selling point to the AW2725QF really is that dual mode support, and for the most part it works pretty well. It switches between configurations without a fuss, it supports multiple different setting options, and basic aspects to performance, whether that's response times or color quality, remain identical across the two modes. Both the 1080p and 4K modes have excellent input lag, which is taken to the next level at 1080p when the refresh rate doubles. This makes the AW2725QF an especially attractive option if you do a lot of competitive multiplayer gaming. Normally when buying a 4K monitor in this price range, you're limited to just 160 or maybe 180Hz, which isn't as clear or responsive as lower resolution 240 or 360Hz panels. With this latest Alienware monitor, you're getting the best of both worlds, a high resolution in the 4K mode for work and single player gaming, with the choice to lower the resolution and increase the refresh rate for competitive play. I think this concept works even better on an LCD than it does on an OLED, because LCDs are highly suited to desktop tasks and productivity. With the AW2725QF, you get a single monitor for work during the day and multiplayer gaming at night. Where this monitor falls a bit short of being excellent is in its response times. The performance on offer is great for 4K 180Hz gaming, but at 360Hz what I'm seeing just isn't fast enough. Don't get me wrong, motion clarity and responsiveness are better in the 1080p 360Hz mode, it's just not at the level we usually see from true 360Hz monitors designed exclusively for that refresh rate. This display is more of a typical 4K IPS LCD in terms of speed that's been converted to run at a higher refresh rate. Outside of motion performance, Dell have calibrated the display pretty well, offering a good sRGB mode and excellent HDR EOTF tracking. The design looks fantastic in my opinion, and there's some neat feature inclusions like eARC over HDMI. But with only edge-lit local dimming, the HDR experience is not very good, especially now that there are plenty of true HDR products on the market. With fantastic 1440p HDR OLEDs like the LG 27GR95QE now hitting $600 US at times, in some sense you are sacrificing HDR to get the 4K dual mode panel at this price point. If this was just a 4K gaming monitor, the price tag would be hard to justify. Its 4K performance isn't all that different to the Gigabyte M27U at $400 US or the LG 27GR93U at $430 US. Effectively, you're paying about $200 US for the 1080p 360Hz mode, which is a hefty premium, especially because Asus have announced the ROG Swift XG27UCG, a similar dual mode monitor priced below $500 US. I should be reviewing that model soon, so stay tuned. I feel like the AW2725QF is a $500 US product at best in the current monitor market. A $100 premium over a regular 4K monitor to get dual mode feels about right, and it stops it from getting so close to more premium HDR products that begin around $600 these days. So I think this is a very simple case of a monitor being generally pretty good, just priced a bit high for what it offers. At the right price for the right gamer that wants versatility, it could be a worthy purchase. So anyway, that does it for this review of the Dell Alienware AW2725QF. If you want to support the channel and our independent monitor testing that we do, please consider becoming a Hardware Unboxed supporter, either via our Patreon account, links to that is in the description below, or we've now just enabled YouTube membership, so if you want to sign up, join right here on YouTube, you can do that as well, and it's a great way to support the channel. Anyway, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching right to the end. A bit of a long one when it comes to a dual mode LCD, but plenty of stuff to go over, and hopefully you've learned all that you need to learn about this monitor. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.